Sama Sambuddhassa Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. It's November 27th, 2023. And these monastic retreats that we do, a lot of what we're teaching is just basic stuff, just the basic day-to-day life, how we can reflect on things that are happening in our daily lives. And there's a progression of retreat, so the questions on the first couple of days is all about things that are happening in people's lives, whether it's work, family. So that's what happens the first couple of days on retreat, is we sit to meditate, and then whatever's happening in our lives, whatever we're doing is really coming up strongly in the mind. Day 3, 4, 5, the mind is starting to settle, and the questions will be more about meditation practice. And then the final day or two is more about people asking more about, how do I integrate this into my daily life when I leave the retreat? How do I take this with me? So these things are just very ordinary, and a lot of what we end up talking about is just ordinary life, and some of the most useful and powerful teachings end up being just around how do we relate to things in a way that accords with Dhamma in our ordinary life, and dealing with just the states that arise, just acknowledging that the body and mind aren't ideal conditions. There is no ideal condition, actually. So we experience things like emotions and tiredness. Sometimes we have energy, sometimes we're tired. And then when we're tired, we might think, well, we're not in this kind of ideal state. So what do I do with that? And we might try to think maybe it's a problem, being tired or exhausted. Or the mind might not be that clear, and we might think, well, I'm a meditator, so my mind's supposed to be clear. Or we might have some sort of desire arising in the mind, or anger, or some sort of agitation. We might think that's wrong. Things shouldn't be that way. But that's just how it is. These things arise, and the body and mind are not in this kind of ideal state. So I can remember having these romantic ideas about monastic life and about being a practitioner. And when I first was getting interested in meditation and started thinking about wanting to be a monk or be some sort of yogi, originally I imagined myself as a cave yogi in the Himalayas before thinking about becoming a monk. And the image I was getting in my mind was kind of this, almost like a movie, like just some sort of really remote kind of abiding in the Himalayas somewhere, really, really far away from everybody and everything. And then I remember going and trying to live in the forest for a week by myself, and I couldn't do it longer than a day, because actually doing it isn't the same as that romantic image in the mind. Actually doing it, it's a completely different experience. It's not at all like what I thought it would be. So it's like when you go and live on the remote side of a mountain, that side becomes close. It's no longer remote. So there's this idea of being remote or being in extreme solitude, but then we're there. This body and mind is there. So I could see for myself wanting to really just get away from this body and mind, but there's no getting away from it. Just wanting to be done with suffering, but there's no being done with it. It's always just there with us. So then what we come back to then is just these very ordinary things. How do we relate to our body and mind? How do we train our body, speech, and mind each day? Just going about our daily tasks, our whatever work we do. If we're living in the monastery, then whatever we're doing in the monastery, how do we just train this body, speech, and mind within the daily living? And over time, these wholesome qualities build up. And when we practice every day, and we're thinking about Dhamma as much as possible, and really we're kind of trying to train ourselves, then eventually things start to get a bit better, and the mind starts to get trained. I'm actually very tired right now, so might end up wandering off on a couple different tracks with this teaching. So depending on whatever else comes up, thoughts about generosity are coming up, and also that's one thing where we might do a retreat and the mind calms down and might become very still during the meditation, and we might think that it's actually from the meditation, but these things don't just come out of nowhere. We have to really plant a lot of causes for them to happen. So generosity is one of those causes, and this is a link that the Buddha makes, which it's not always readily apparent, that if our mind becomes peaceful during a period of retreat, one of the main causes of that is generosity done before that. So before we do a retreat, it's skillful to perform acts of generosity. Or I remember hearing this teaching in Thailand that if your mind isn't becoming peaceful, try to be more generous. And I didn't make those links at first when I started practicing. So later on it became a bit more obvious that generosity, followed by a period of retreat, that's really the way to do it. So why is that? Why does generosity lead to peaceful states of mind during a retreat? And I think a lot of it is we're actually learning how to let go. With generosity, we're learning how to be less selfish, so less self-centered, or self-centric, as I like to think about it. And we become more other-centric, so we're actually developing qualities like empathy and caring about others, not just caring about ourselves, not just caring about me and my practice. We're actually caring about others, so we're actually coming out of our heads and not focusing on ourselves so much. So then the meditation becomes much more clear when the meditation is less self-centered. Because when we meditate, we can become very self-centered. It's not very peaceful when we're self-centered. The sense of self, ultimately, it's a reference point. And with the Dhamma, there's no reference. The Dhamma itself is the reference, but it's not a center. It's not like the sense of self where it's a very tight, where it's a tight point that's very limiting and exclusive. So the Dhamma, we talk about the Dhamma having no reference point. It's expansive, all-encompassing, spacious, powerful. So when we come out of ourselves, or we're less self-centric, self-centered in the meditation, it can change the experience quite a bit, and generosity is one of the causes of that, of that to arise, that experience. Also, as we practice, in the path of practice, various things can happen, and there are various pitfalls that we have to be careful of. And one that I was kind of reflecting on today was, as we practice, there is a phenomenon that can happen where we actually become more refined in our preferences. We might experience some sort of peace and well-being and stillness, but then there's this unwholesome state that can creep in, where we actually then try to shift everything in our external life to protect that peace and stillness. And so our comfort zone becomes much smaller, actually. We have to have much more specific conditions around us all the time. And our preferences become much more refined, and sometimes it can actually become difficult to stay in that type of a comfort zone that becomes smaller and smaller. And it's very easy for that to happen as we practice, especially as we practice many years. That type of a state can actually creep in very easily. And we should be aware of it, and we do need to catch that kind of thing, because that's the opposite of Kanti. That's the opposite of developing this Kanti Barami, this patient endurance that Lumpur Cha would speak about. So if things are heading in the proper direction, then our comfort zone should actually become bigger, and we should actually learn how to become more okay with unpleasantness when it arises, and that every state arising, being more and more okay with it, rather than having to protect this very unstable sense of peace and happiness that we've achieved, maybe through a good meditation. So when we develop this sense of expansiveness, and this seems to be a hallmark of the Lumpur Cha, Lumpur Sumedho tradition, this sense of expansiveness and expanding our comfort zone to really include ideally any state. So whether states are pleasant or unpleasant, then this expanded comfort zone actually really it can eventually encompass everything, to the point that whatever we experience, whatever comes our way, it's not going to shake us. And there's not going to be any sense of worry or having to protect some sort of very, very small, narrow comfort zone. And that's the stability and unshakability that comes from that kind of expansiveness. So that we can experience things like tiredness, and it's okay. We can experience criticism, and it's okay. We can experience praise, and we won't become lost in it. We can be around people we like, and we can be around people we might dislike, and it's okay. We can learn from every situation. We can be in the monastery or outside of the monastery, and it's okay. We can be healthy or sick, and it's okay. So once we talk about a state like that, that's very expansive, then it's obvious that there's no fear in that state. It's stability, confidence, fearlessness. Because anything that arises, it's okay. It's good. It's all good. And we're good if we're there. In the course of the practice, we have all these precepts. So there's the 5 precepts of the lay practitioners. So with something like the cultivation of mindfulness and clear awareness of our actions through our daily lives, we call it sense restraint, but the word restraint is kind of a negative word and implies tension. So I like to think of it more as sense composure, composing the sense faculties. And when we do that, we're able to see the mind more clearly, unshakable on the inside.